I'm going to be giving an overview of what were really 4 separate studies near Bay Jimmy, Louisiana. First, the immediate results of a multi-year marsh treatment test, and second, a separate study using vegetation planting as a form of restoration following cleanup. And then I'll be giving updates to that work, which you may not have seen yet.
Yeah, so we're almost there.
Great.
Okay, I think we're good. Good?
And these studies comprise the famous NOAA set-asides or remediation experiments that were mentioned a little earlier. And I met Scott when he was working as a consulting scientist for NOAA, serving as SCAT scientific lead. And with NOAA, he was able to spearhead the creation of these marsh set-asides and this cleanup experiment that was done on them as a way to adaptively manage treatment recommendations, especially during the early phases of cleanup following the spill. So the findings of those experiments were used to inform the shoreline treatment recommendations, which specify the tools and techniques used in specific areas of treatment. So the questions our study sought to address were first, whether cleanup treatment techniques improved oiling conditions and ecosystem recovery when compared to natural recovery, reflected by plots that did not receive any treatment. And part of answering that question is looking at different measures of what cleanup success is, and seeing that oil is not the only metric, and as we heard from some of our earlier speakers, might not even be the most important metric. Other ecological metrics of recovery and restored functioning might be more meaningful. And second, we asked whether actively revegetating following cleanup influenced the benefits of treatment itself. And third, we reflected on the outcomes to allow us to consider what future cleanup might look like for similar situations and what challenges we would still face moving forward. So, setting the stage, these images convey how impacted Bay Jimmy originally was. This is what it looks like in June 2010 when the shoreline received extremely heavy oiling. And we heard earlier that high energy settings are best left alone to recover naturally, and how rapidly oil can weather and degrade when exposed to high wave conditions. But this site represents an outlier, which might be an exception to that rule, based on the degree of oiling that it received. It's a very high energy site that experiences rapid background rates of erosion. But these kind of heavily oiled conditions did occur probably on the order of miles or maybe tens of miles, I believe, across Louisiana. So while they represent overall a small subset of the impacted shorelines, this could be a critical site for informing how we manage the most serious spills affecting marshes in the future. And this is more of what it looked like at our study site a bit later in 2010. In panels B and C, you can see that heavy oiling persisted. You can see here a tarry mat with moose trapped underneath the asphalt. And the fact that conditions were not improving is what indicated the need for some form of intervention. And this last panel is along the same shoreline, a reference area that was left relatively unoiled. And again, these are post-treatment shoreline outcomes in 2012, comparing the unoiled reference site up at the top left to manual treatment versus no treatment, and finally mechanical treatment and planting over here, so you can see what the importance of planting might be. While NOAA's initial work tested a number of cleanup methods, the ones that were less effective were discontinued moving forward, and the set-asides were used to monitor the longer-term ones that were employed during the spill. Those consisted of 4 different treatments. The 3 oil treatments included controls that were not cleaned in any way, and in addition to the manual treatment and the mechanical treatment. And we also had the reference conditions that were unimpacted. Then in 2011, I initiated the planting experiments alongside those initial ones, using areas that had already been mechanically treated. So some of the questions I wanted to ask were a bit more detailed about the nature of plant-soil interactions, and a bit more general in terms of marsh ecology, not just relating to oil spill cleanup. So to that end, the controls that I used were actually kept devegetated during the first year to compare just the plant effect on recovery. But that actually didn't require that much intervention, as you'll see, as there wasn't a lot of natural establishment over that time period. And here's a map of the study site showing the layout of the test plots that I'm going to be talking about. And along the shoreline, plots were very similar in terms of characteristics like initial vegetation composition and the oiling conditions and wave exposure, except for the reference plots located down here, which were relatively unoiled. And again, this is a close-up of the ground conditions during plot setup, showing the oiled vegetation mat of dead, laid-over vegetation forming a tarry mat, and the moose trapped underneath that mat layer that's not been able to weather. And this is a picture of the mechanical treatments that were used. We heard a little bit about mechanical and manual treatments earlier from Marla, so I won't dwell on it too much, other than to remind you that manual treatment means boots on the ground using hand tools to scrape and remove oil and oiled material, while mechanical treatments do the same thing using equipment like this, which is a shallow draft barge mounted with a long arm track hoe, which can also take a variety of hydraulic attachments. And then in the inset picture, you can see these barges were mounted with roll-up containers and used for the disposal of these materials. Okay, now I'm first going to be showing you the results from the first 2 years of the experiment, comparing the effects of using manual or mechanical treatment versus no treatment at all and the reference conditions, and the slides will follow this format. First, comparing surface oil cover across treatments, we see that treatment had significantly reduced oil compared to no treatment, but still had significantly more than the reference areas. And we did collect sediment chemistry supporting this, but I'm not going to be going into that much detail in this presentation. Looking at plant community recovery, we see that recolonization improved with treatment. Oh, sorry. This is going a bit too far. Looking at plant community here, you can see that recolonization did improve with treatment, but it remained extremely low, under 20% after 2 years, compared to the reference marshes. And it's been mentioned, but I don't think we've spent enough time considering the severe background rates of marsh loss in this setting, including rapid rates of shoreline erosion. So the high energy that weathers oil also deteriorates marshes and reduces marsh habitat. The figure that's commonly thrown around is that we lose a football field of marsh an hour, but I think that's even out of date and the current rates are probably higher. And we've talked about the problem of potentially doing more harm than good, which relates to that, as boots on the ground trample plants, but I want to reiterate how susceptible the marsh platform itself is to compaction. So for instance, while summer might be a great time for natural attenuation, it's also when the marsh is most sensitive to physical damage, because being so saturated with water, when water levels are higher, it becomes very fragile to displacement and roots become even more susceptible to damage. So looking here, while oil exacerbates erosion by killing plants along the shoreline, remediation activities could actually make things worse by damaging that marsh substrates. And here you can see that while erosion was significantly higher in treated areas compared to references, erosion was significantly higher in treated areas compared to references and on par with no treatment at all. Okay, so this is a plot about 2 months after planting. The plantings were done with bare root single stems of Spartina alterniflora using local source material, and the stems were planted by hand, approximately 2 or 3 stems per square meter. And this is what those plots looked like after establishment. So the same plot here planted 2 years later. And the results are pretty dramatic. The dotted line here represents the edge of the planted plots. So all of the erosion beyond that point was not planted. And you can see that in 1 year, more than 4 meters eroded up to that boundary of where the plot was planted. in the planted plots, and then continued on for more than 2 additional meters in the unplanted plots that received treatment. So, moving forward in time, we continued monitoring recovery over the next 3 years, discontinuing the manual treatments to focus on mechanical, which were made operational scale during response operations and applied across a variety of locations in northern Barataria Bay. And this photo is from fall 2016 in a planted plot. So you can see that the plantings are surviving and not being impacted by oil, but there is residual surface oiling still there, making that tarry layer. So the asphalt remains. And in the plots that were not actively planted, this asphalt layer prevented new vegetation from becoming very well established. And there's actually some interesting work showing how this asphalt layer contributes to rates of shoreline erosion in the long term. I'll come back to that in a bit. And here, this is another one from fall 2016 showing also the residual subsurface oiling. So it's possible that some of the treatment techniques actually mixed this oiling further down into the substrate layer. And speaking a bit about some of the points that were made earlier, I can't say that none of the oil out there now in 2016 is new. It very well could be new, but there's absolutely still oil out there from the 2010 spill. There are spots like this one where the tarry asphalt simply never went away, and as the margins break up, they're continually producing new little tar balls that litter the scarp. So this, again, is the same layout that I'm going to use over the next few slides, comparing the reduced set of treatments, but also the planting treatment. So the references that were not oiled, the oiled control mechanical treatment, and the mechanical treatment after planting. And looking at the oil cover over the surface, you can see that it was reduced much more rapidly by mechanical treatment. And while the control subsequently caught up, the treatments that were planted continue to see much greater reduction in oil cover throughout the 3 years. And from the photos I showed of planting, you could see that Spartina alterniflora expanded to successfully colonize the plots, which this data supports. In the planted plots, we saw even higher levels of overall plant cover than references, while the oiled control and the mechanical treatment never fully caught up. And this breaks down in a bit more detail what those plant communities look like. The important takeaway is that in the treatment ones, it was most comparable to the original reference conditions. In the non-planted treatments, you saw a lot of disturbance-associated plants with shallower root systems. And throughout all of them, you do see, as was mentioned earlier, this failure for juncus to rebound. And I suspect that what that is juncus occupied a really narrow band of area at this particular site with Spartina on either side of it. And after the initial rapid amounts of erosion, that band was simply eliminated and never reestablished. Really quickly, because I think I'm running over time, I'm just going to point out some results from the invertebrate work, showing what the recovery looks like. For instance here, that total periwinkle densities are still reduced through 2015. I'm going to skip over this a little bit. And we also have some results from crab species looking at burrow density, showing again reduced recovery compared to reference conditions with some improvement with treatment. And finally, just these are some nice clear pictures emphasizing what the difference was with planting following treatment. Here you can see Spartina fully colonizing the platform, while these plots are occupied by more disturbance-associated species. And you can see how erosion is affecting those different areas of occupation. Moving forward, again, this is the planted plot in the background with much less erosion than these other ones. And you're seeing a lot of erosion underneath the scarp here. And finally, 2015, this erosion under the scarp is going to eventually lead to the collapse of this platform, and it's something that's not occurring as badly in the Spartina colonized swamps. So even though we do see already high rates of erosion, over time you're going to have a very sudden event of extreme erosion, and that's something that a grad student out of Eugene Turner's lab at LSU has done some great work on. Okay, so in conclusion, we found that treatment did improve oiling conditions and recovery, especially after the first few years, when there may have been recovery from some initial side effects, such as using the mechanical treatments to dig too deeply and impair the roots of a plant platform. Importantly, however, planting improved benefits of treatment to a really large degree, especially for vegetation recovery, which cascaded to affect rates of shoreline erosion. Challenges moving forward are determining the best treatment type and intensity for the shoreline that's affected and holding back when appropriate, finding a fit for planting in response, or as NERDA, emergency restoration, which I'd like to say a little bit more about, and establishing set-asides or controls for comparisons moving forward. So in my experience, we actually met with oil spill response and incident command during cleanup operations to make a case for keeping these set-asides and trying to convince them of the importance of having these oiled sites to continue collecting data to show the effectiveness of our treatment options. And that was very controversial because the trustees did not want to accept liability for leaving that oil out there and any damages that could accrue in the future. Eventually we were able to keep the reduced set of plots, but that's part of the reason why the experiment was scaled down somewhat moving forward. In addition, while it's been very well received, so I hear the fact that planting made such an improvement, like Jackie was saying earlier, there's still need to find a fit for that planting response as part of the initial treatment options. It's not currently considered part of that toolkit, and it's unclear how to get that incorporated maybe into the area contingency plans moving forward for future spills. And I'm gonna skip that. There are a lot of people to thank.
Yeah, you can thank them.